I have been escaping into the 16th century for almost a week now, into chapters of history that are more exciting than any movie I have seen in recent years. Now, I have to say, I grew up learning about Mary, Queen of Scots. My mother was Scottish. 2 years ago, I visited several places where her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, confined her during almost 20 years of imprisonment or seclusion. But I had no idea how much drama surrounded the life of her little boy, James Stewart, the king behind the King James Bible, or Majeste, as James VI of Scotland and the First of England was known. David Teems has written this historical treasure. And, you know, the last time David was here, I knew he was up to fascinating writing, not this, and I said, we have got to get you back. But now I am completely blown away as to why a Tennessean musician would have such an interest in a Scottish king.
That's a good question. I've not been asked that before. It all started with Shakespeare. I'm pretty much a Shakespeare geek. And so, you know, when you study enough about the Elizabethan, late Elizabethan, early Jacobean reign, sooner or later you're going to see that odd figure in the periphery, you know, over there in the margins. And I began to do that. I studied Shakespeare. I went to plays and you know, all the audio books and everything. And this, strangely enough, too, going back a little further, when I first got saved in 1981, I do what you always do, go out and buy a King James Bible. I read it through a couple of times. And strangely, those resonances got me back into Shakespeare as an adult. Because I was real into Shakespeare in college, but it just didn't take, you know, because it was studying, it was breaking it down. But through Shakespeare, I started seeing, you know, I discovered James.
So he was just
fascinating.
The language, you loved the prose of it.
I'm all about language. I'm not really a biographer or historian. I'm more of a literary, and I even approached this book as a novel, and yet hopefully kept the scholarship very reliable.
Oh, it is. It is. Who would have thought that the man wrote so much? I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I mean, he was a published author when he came to the throne. And when he first made his procession in the new country, England,
right. Shakespeare,
the man himself, was trailing behind.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, one of the more curious things that I discovered was that James, of course, it took him 2 months to get to town. He wanted to be magnanimous. I mean, he would stop in towns. Elizabeth she knighted less than 300 people her whole reign. James knighted 300 on his way to England.
He just seemed to enjoy doing that thing.
He was making friends. He was very politically minded. But yeah, by the time he came to town, probably April or May, and within 2 weeks, 1604, 1603, I'm sorry. 1603. Strangely enough, within 2 weeks, less than a fortnight, he had a patent drawn up, which is a legal warrant, making Shakespeare's troupe, the Lord Chamberlain's men, making them the king's men.
His private little drama team.
Yeah, and you read that in histories, and I want to go, wait a minute, stop, because they go on and say other stuff, and I go, wait a minute, why? Why did he do this? And my take is that it was a propaganda move. Because one thing, nobody could give kings like Shakespeare could give kings. I mean, he has King Lear, he's got Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, Henry VIII. He's got all these kings, and so he can give people kings. He can disperse that majesty that James is so thrilled with.
He loved it.
It was a belief system with James. But also, it was just a good propaganda move. Here, the greater is trailing behind the lesser, to me. I mean, here's Shakespeare.
Shakespeare was already famous.
Oh, yeah, he was very large. He was a phenomenon. According to Peter Ackroyd, Shakespeare was a phenomenon, particularly by 1604. Hamlet was in 1601, and that changed everything.
And Macbeth was about King James.
Absolutely. There's a lot of links to James in there. Plus, it was a short play. It was a short play. James, according to one modern scholar, has labeled him ADHD, and so
that's why there aren't many portraits of him, many paintings.
Oh, that's true.
Because you say he couldn't sit still long enough.
He couldn't sit still long enough for a painting. Yeah, the image blurs.
Let's get to the Macbeth bit.
Okay.
And the part where I've had so much experience and tracked. I mean, some of this I did know. He nearly didn't make it.
Exactly. Yeah.
He was due to be born in June, 2 months before March 9th, 1566. Tell us what happened to his mother.
This is how the book opens up. His mother is 6 months pregnant with James, and she's having a little dinner party in her
at Holyrood Palace.
Right, in her room with some of her friends, including a musician named David, strangely enough, a guitar player named David Rizzio.
Italian.
He's an Italian. He speaks French, and he's got that French connection. Sounds like a movie. He's got this her heart is French. She's got this French soul, and I think he gives her a taste of home, and they're just friends. They've been accused of being lovers and things like that, but he wasn't that attractive. He was very short, and Mary was very tall. She was 5'11", and even today that would be kind of tall, but back then it was very tall. And so was her husband, Lord Darnley. But her husband,
her second husband,
Lord Darnley.
Because her first husband was indeed French.
Right.
French royal.
He came in that night, busted into her room with his friends, his associates, and one of his friends put a gun to Mary's womb.
Very large.
Yeah, and put a gun
belly.
to it. And of course, Mary's just stunned, like, what are you doing? And so they were basically taking vengeance out on this musician, accusing him of, having done all kind of things and being a lover of the Queen and stuff. And so they basically have her watch him being butchered in front of the 50s, anywhere from 50 to 60 something stabs, probably 64 stab wounds, and made her watch.
I did see the blood stains in the
really?
floor
Okay, because
at Holyrood Palace in 1965. I don't know if it's still visible, but it was unmistakable back then.
Well, she swore revenge. She kind of, collected herself, and she cried at first, and then she held her tears and just kind of swore revenge and within a short time, probably within less than a year, Darnley was dead. And Mary conspired with another spoiled boy,
Bothwell.
yes, and or the story goes, it's least suspected that it was her, and Darnley was blown from his own house, over the house. It's a fascinating story.
Oh,
it just is.
And well, we'll have to say that. We have to go back.
We can only scratch the surface, too, as a sad
Let me
thing.
show you a couple of pictures. First, our visit to Stirling Castle, where the young prince was safely born on what date?
June 19th.
June 19th. And this is me here at the castle.
All right.
And I think the garb would have been something like that back then. And there's my son there. This and Holyrood.
He might have looked like that.
Yeah.
No, just kidding.
This was a home. Stirling Castle and Holyrood Palace were homes, whereas Edinburgh Castle was a military fortress.
Right.
Now, it looks a little stark to me for a home. And then this is the Church of the Holy Rood. An unusual word, but it means cross, right?
Mm-hmm.
The rood is the cross. There's the young prince. This dear man was closing as we just snuck in there to this very famous church. And you'll see that this is the length of it here. Mm-hmm. This is where the coronation took place for the 13-month-old James Stuart. Mm-hmm. And just of note, I'm climbing the pulpit, which I think was the favorite of John Knox, who really was the nemesis of Mary Stuart. He called her Jezebel.
He liked that word, too. He used it a lot.
This is the very spot, and we'll go in a little closer to see the plaque that marks here on the 29th of July, 1567, the infant son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was crowned James VI, King of Scots. And like almost all his predecessors, he didn't really get to rule. There were regents.
Right. Scotland preferred that too, for minority kings. That way, because power was kind of a bouncing ball. It went from the Presbyterian Church to the nobles or whatever faction, and it was just it was efficient to have a child king or queen.
Except you wouldn't want to be regent because they were all assassinated.
They were all assassinated.
Boom,
it was
boom,
not
boom,
a very
boom.
fortunate job, so. But James is, strangely enough, when he was born, it's called a caul, C-A-U-L. It's kind of I guess the amniotic sac is still intact, but it was almost like a covering he was born in, which was an incredible prophetic insight or a prophetic image for his life, because he was very fearful all of his life. Matter of fact, he talked about that. He said, I was fearful from the time I was in my mother's womb.
You write a timid, friendless boy
Yes.
with a tragic desire to be loved.
Absolutely.
When did he lose his mom?
Well, she was beheaded in 1587 by Mary.
But she left him.
By Elizabeth, but she was taken away from him when James was 11 months old, and vilified to him after that. One of the requirements to work with the child was that basically you had to have this antipathy toward the Queen of Scots. You had to hate the Queen of Scots. His teacher Buchanan, who first was a friend of Mary's and wrote really nice things about her, then started writing very vicious things about her, and it was one of the prerequisites to work with James.
And James actually had a very good relationship with the woman who killed his mother. Right. Queen Elizabeth
That's
I.
true. That's true. Elizabeth was she was so far above all of them as far as wit and just the way she pretty much held, it was carrot and stick between her and James all these for the inheritance of the throne. She would give him a stipend of anywhere from £3,000 to £5,000, and usually it was on the 3 side, and James was always dependent on it because he was always broke. Scotland was always broke. And she was the closest thing. It's some levels of distance between them, but she was the closest thing he had to a mother. And we were talking about this earlier when Elizabeth had Mary executed. James basically just had to turn his head and let it happen. But the thing is, he never had any contact with his mother. They wouldn't allow letters. She would send him toys because she was put away. She was secluded. It was the official word. It was
all over
basically
Britain.
Imprisoned. Well, yes. She made the mistake of going into Britain, and then Elizabeth took over, and so she was moved from castle to castle to castle because they didn't want any chance of her being rescued by any of her sympathizers.
Yeah, and there were plots. Oh my goodness, our time's going too fast. 9 kidnap attempts before the time he started to rule at age. How old was James when he finally?
He was probably in his late teens
when
he really took the reins, probably 18, something like that.
Now, I don't know if you saw Piers Morgan, who launched in Larry King's spot on CNN last night.
No, I didn't.
But he recently quoted the Queen Mum's rules of deportment, quote, never complain, never explain, never be heard speaking in public. Well, here we have James, who wrote personal messages to his public. I mean, not just books, but...
Yeah.
Oh, you've got to read some of this because this should be on cigarette packages in place of the Surgeon General's warning. Page 128, A Counterblast to Tobacco. Now, this isn't one of his best sellers. This is just a little thing he wrote in 1604.
Let me read the whole section here.
Oh, go ahead. You got to hear this.
Surely smoke becomes a kitchen. Now, this is written in the original spelling, too. One of the things I want to do in the book, the original spelling is so charming, because it kind of it's kind of like our text messaging today. But surely smoke becomes a kitchen far better than a dining chamber, and yet it makes a kitchen also oftentimes in the inward parts of men, soiling and infecting them with an unctuous and oily kind of soot. You're right. This should be on the side of
cigarette package,
as hath been found in some great tobacco takers that after their death were opened. Have you not reason to be ashamed and forbear this filthy novelty, so basely grounded, so foolishly received, and so grossly mistaken in the right use thereof? In your abuse thereof, sinning against God, harming yourselves both in persons and goods, raking also thereby the marks and notes of vanity upon you, by the custom thereof making yourselves to be wondered at by all foreign civil nations, and by all strangers that come among you, to be scorned and contemned, a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of that pit that is bottomless. That's from A Counterblast of Tobacco. One thing about James hated Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh.
Did he have him executed?
Yes, he did.
Didn't he? Finally.
But this was after he had him in prison, and he was going to execute him. And on the day of his execution, right at the last minute, he gives a reprieve, almost as a joke. You can almost hear James chuckling. Of course, it wasn't a joke to Sir Walter Raleigh. But Raleigh had convinced him that he could find El Dorado, the city of gold. So he allows Raleigh to go on this expedition. Of course, Raleigh didn't find him, and he lost his son in the process, and it broke Raleigh's heart. But Raleigh was the anti-James. He was the good-looking, suave. He was a pirate. He was a poet. He was a friend of Elizabeth. He had all of these wonderful things go for him. And James was just not any of those things. And so James had, and even James's son, Henry, Prince of Wales, had a really good relationship with Sir Walter Raleigh. And he actually said once that only someone like my dad could keep such a bird in a cage, talking about Raleigh being in prison. But part of this attack in the subtext is against Sir Walter Raleigh.
Who brought tobacco from
over,
the New World.
Who brought the stinking stuff over. So.
These are just some of the things that you would never imagine are part of all this history. And, you know, a conflicted personality. You know, here's a man who had a chapter of Scripture read
to him every day
at every
meals.
dinner meal, every day, who maybe the banner scripture over his life mission, it certainly became to be a peacemaker. Blessed are the peacemakers.
Right.
He physically put his body across England and Scotland out of a desire
to... He really did.
Yeah,
he actually
he lay down
physically
on the ground,
wanting
to unite the countries, unite the religions. He didn't succeed in everything, but this great goal of
without him, there would be no King James Bible. And the book in the subtext preaches God's election, how God used such a flawed and damaged person to do something that could not be done at any other time of history. That late Elizabethan, early Jacobean, the language, that powerful linguistic vitality that just saturated the age of Shakespeare, of Sir Walter Raleigh, of Elizabeth, who was literary herself, James. We will never see that type of power, linguistic power again in our language, and it would not have happened without James.
It's very cool in the back of the book, the rules that governed the work of the translation, the care he took to this. He even had a birthmark on him that looked at the shape of a lion.
Of a lion,
I mean, he felt called to be God's. I mean, part of this was the divine right of kings.
Well, that was like Majeste was like a belief system with him. It was like a faith, and that's one of the things he brought to the table when it came to the translation. He wanted the language to be set forth gorgeously, to reflect his reign, to reflect majesty. That his book would be, he called it the Eirenikon, or the thing of peace. His motto was Beati Pacificae, which means blessed are the peacemakers. He called himself Rex Pacificus, the peacemaking king, and part of that was because of his damaged psychology. He brought this damaged, divided psychology, this whole thing of England and Scotland, or Mary and Elizabeth, all of these things. You know, James was a study in contrast. So, in essence, he wanted peace. Part of his bid for peace was almost a self-medication, and that goes into the book and the notion of divine right. We were talking about this in another interview, that divine right, absolute monarchy, is imposed in the book itself. When I hear someone say the phrase King James only, that's an absolutist phrase, but he was an absolutist king. And no English Bible reflects that monarchy or that majesty, that absolutism, like the King James Bible does. And we may think that that's a bad thing, but we serve a monarchist God. We serve an absolutist God who suffers no other head. We
don't have time to unpack it, and it'll certainly ignite a huge flame everywhere. But you say the authorized version isn't authorized. You're going to have to read the book to find out what that really means. Majeste, the king behind the King James Bible, despite all the intrigue and the conflicts of this individual, this unlikely individual, the takeaway for me is who God will use.
Absolutely. How
powerfully used this man was, despite all his imperfections. The great news...
He chooses the foolish things of the world to
confound the wise. Absolutely,
the weak
Paul's
things
words.
To confound the mighty.
David, the good news is we get to have you for the whole month of February for Truth to Go.